Welcome to another episode of Franchise Envy, and I'm your host, Lance Gralick.
Up next.
So I funded this. I self-funded this through our own personal assets. So I guess the proverbial shoebox. But one of them is kind of going off script or going off the playbook. And
Why does that always happen?
I don't know.
I said that though, Brad. The floor is $2 million.
Right.
And the other thing that people are probably leaning into as they're listening to this, a lot of people just want to build $1 million business to start. You hear on one territory you're doing $2 million, and it's only with a handful of employees, right? I have Brad Hawkins of Floor Coverings International, franchisee. Welcome to the show, Brad.
Thanks, Lance. Looking forward to it. Happy to be here.
Thank you for being here. So, Brad, how long have you been a franchisee?
So I've been a franchisee for a little over 3 years. We just had our 3-year anniversary in early April. I signed on with Floor Coverings at the end of 2021, went to convention, went to training, and then opened our doors in early April of 2022.
So what were you doing before joining Floor Coverings International?
Prior to joining Floor Coverings International, I spent most of my career in the Washington, D.C. area in the field of private wealth management. So I've been doing that for 13, 14 years, working with high net worth individuals and families, foundations, nonprofits, etc. Money management, financial planning, things of that nature in the Washington and Baltimore markets.
So is this your first official business of your own?
This is my first official business. I always had this in mind and a dream of mine, but this is the first one.
Good deal. Now, how did you find it, and why Floor Coverings International above all the other 4,000 franchise options?
Yeah, so it's somewhat of a funny serendipitous story how I found myself where I am right now. When I decided to leave the field of private wealth management, I left with the goal of starting my own business. And I was dead set on that. I wasn't going to put a resume together. I was going to start my own business. And through a few months of research and brainstorming and whatnot, wasn't necessarily coming up with a great business idea of my own, or at least one that my wife wouldn't sign off on. And we happened to take a trip to visit some friends in Charleston, South Carolina. One of my best friends down there, and his name is Rob, and one of Rob's next door neighbors is a gentleman who's a franchise consultant. And so we're on the trip over Labor Day in 2021, and he said, well, you should talk to Chuck. Chuck had been an operator in the franchising world himself and now was working as a consultant. And that led to a conversation a couple weeks later, and at that point started looking at various brands in the franchising space. And really what I, as started working with Chuck and directing him, focused him on the home services space for a variety of reasons we could get into. Narrowed, started with maybe 4 or 5 brands and started narrowing that down. And from the start, Floor Coverings International really stuck out for a variety of reasons. The biggest one was just such a highly differentiated business model in our space and how we go to market. In my prior life in financial services, we had a very different business model, and we really hung our hat on that. And so I appreciated coming on board with a brand that had just such a different model on how we run residential flooring appointments. Number 2 was just a passionate commitment to customer service and client service and doing what's right with clients. That culture permeated throughout sort of the getting to know you process with Floor Coverings International. And there's others, but I'd say the third and top reason that I thought this would be a good journey to go on was, and this was a space where I thought I could really make a difference using a lot of the skills that I learned and grew in my prior role in terms of building relationships and networks and client referrals and things like that in the home services space. Obviously, selling a completely different widget, but so much from my prior life, applies to what we're doing today.
Yeah, no, I love that answer. So when it comes to the all-in investment or number of territories as well, did you start with 1 or 2 territories?
Yeah, so I started with 1 territory. So you mentioned we're in upstate New York, so central New York, which for folks who know where Syracuse is, it's roughly about an hour and a half radius around Syracuse. So 1 territory, and that initial all-in investment was right around $275,000, give or take.
And did you take that out of a shoebox, or did you get a loan for that?
So I funded this. I self-funded this through our own personal assets. So I guess the proverbial shoebox. But yeah, that's how we've approached it. Fortunate enough to be able to do that.
I also wanted to ask, when you mentioned earlier, you were talking about, hey, do I start my own business? Don't really necessarily have an idea for that. Your wife wasn't necessarily on board. But did you also look at existing businesses? There's a lot of people on the internet talking about just buy, buy a business. Buy a business. An old couple's retiring that still has a fax machine, and you can buy it and make it better. Did you think of that?
So I didn't think of buying an existing business, and the primary reason, a couple of primary reasons for wanting to start a business, we can get into that, but one of them was I wanted the challenge of creating something out of nothing. I wanted to start something from scratch. I wanted to make it my own. Not to say I might not buy a business down the line, but for my first venture and foray into business ownership, I wanted to start from scratch. And so I was looking for, territory and a brand where I could be able to do that.
Yeah. And that's my recommendation to everybody that's a first-time business owner, is to do exactly what you did and really push those muscles, so to speak. And then from there you can literally go anywhere.
That's exactly right. And it's kind of funny, coming from the corporate world where I spent most of my career, we had big job, big office, big team. But at the end of the day, it's a completely different animal than running a small business and starting a franchise. And so, and that's part of what the excitement of it was.
So was size a factor? My clientele, myself being a franchise broker, my clientele a lot of times might start off by saying, I would like a big brand. That's a criteria of mine. And I said, well, how big of a brand? And they said, something really well established. Well, what is well established to you? And you hear things like 500 locations or more. And I was like, whoa, I could show you brands that have 30 locations to me that are incredibly well established. So does size, or did size, matter in the selection process to you?
No, size wasn't, honestly, not a consideration whatsoever. It was really more so finding the right culture fit, the right market fit, the skill set fit with what I have. But, of all those that I looked at, there was another one that was tied to another very well-known brand that was kind of like a sister brand that you would get some of those knock-on effects of that brand, but it just wasn't a consideration for me. I was making sure it was a fit for me, and me a fit for them too, right?
Yeah. Good. What was, if you think back, what was the hardest part of launching this particular brand? Maybe something you hadn't thought of.
Boy, the hardest part of launching. Let me narrow that down. I think it's just, as I mentioned a minute ago, it's coming into it thinking, you're coming from the corporate world, you've done hard things, you've managed teams, you've operated at a level, I can handle this, and it is such a different animal, and I don't mean to be cliche with it, but it's really, you're coming in wearing all the hats, and from the most important things down to some very minor things, but minor things that need to get done, and you're the one responsible for that. Fortunately, I had somebody along the way from the very start who was instrumental in getting us off the ground, and still is with us, and an instrumental part of our growth. But for me, it was really just all the buckets, all the different facets of the business, coming in and really having to take ownership for all those.
Got it. So let's talk about the biggest mistakes that maybe franchisees in general make. From your experiences, you've seen a lot. What are the biggest mistakes that new franchise owners make?
Yes, so a couple of mistakes come to mind. One of them is kind of going off script or going off the playbook. And,
Why does that always happen?
I don't know. It's a little bit baffling. I think you come in, you maybe think you got some good ideas. I thought, and I always draw back to, why did you join a franchise, right? And so there's a proven model there. There are people who have been there, done that. There are people who have tried to go off script, learn their lesson, and come back on script. And so, I think, there may be a time, who knows, maybe there's a time and place for that down the line, because once you have more experience. But when you're new or brand new or newer, you've got to execute the playbook. It's there for a reason. The franchise model's there for a reason. There is a massive support system in place for a reason, and take advantage of that. I think another area that I see newer franchisees make a mistake, and this ties directly to at least why I bought a franchise, is you have this network of people and not asking for help, not relying on them. One of the big things that drew me to floor coverings, doing validation calls in my interview process, I talked to probably 6 to 8 owners. They were incredibly forthcoming, incredibly forthright about their experience, incredibly helpful to the point where I had follow-on calls with a few of them. And I could tell from the start, just in that interview process and diligence phase, this is a network of folks who are really there to help you and support, and this is a rising tide lifts all boats mentality. And if I get into a pickle or I have a challenge, shame on me or any newer franchisee who doesn't take advantage of that and look out and reach out to XYZ or over here across the country, established people who've been there and done that. And I just and doing it before it's too late. So that mistake is maybe a newer franchisee does get around to doing that and just that asking for help. It could be humbling, right? And you just kind of sometimes have to eat that humble pie and say, I need help. Whether that's from another franchisee or the brand, right? Their incentives are aligned, right? We all want to grow, and not availing yourself to those resources can be a big mistake.
I tell people all the time that a lot of people forget about the collaborative nature of what a franchise is meant to be. It's like a giant mastermind, except you actually have brothers and sisters, franchisees, that are doing exactly what you're doing, and none of you are competitive. You all have your own exclusive territories, so there's no reason that it's not the classic case. It is the classic case always of a rising tide raises all ships. So it's really pretty magical when it works right.
Yeah, and I think floor coverings has that, right? I think it's in the culture from the biggest people in the system, down to people starting out. Everybody's got something to share, and I think that was something that really to this day I talk to other FCI owners, if not daily, multiple a week.
So you mentioned some of the biggest people. Let's talk money, what I call the show me the money segment. I know there's franchisees doing 10 million plus, and there's quite a few multi-million-dollar a year franchise owners. What is it? What can you do per territory? A couple of million a territory. Tell me a little bit about the numbers.
Sure. Yeah. On the numbers, so a couple million a territory is what we think about as our floor right now, and so that's where newer franchisees signing on, getting to $2 million in a single territory. That's the or I guess I would say maybe the initial goal or the floor. From there, we're thinking about how then you scale from 2 to 4 or 5, and there's folks in the system working to get to 10, and there's different pathways on how to do that. But I think how we really think about it is each single territory should be able to generate top line $2 million.
I like how you said that, though, Brad. The floor is $2 million.
Right.
And the other thing that people are probably leaning into as they're listening to this, a lot of people just want to build $1 million business to start. You hear on one territory you're doing $2 million, and it's only with a handful of employees, right?
Yeah, a handful. I think at that level, you're at 3 or 4, probably. Maybe 5. It depends. And everybody bought in this and has different visions. But I think everybody, I would say probably across the board, everybody bought in this vision to grow a business, to get to some level. And I think when you're getting to that level, you've got 3 or 4 on your team work with you, and it's doable.
And as far as the net income on this, I've heard 15%. Obviously, it's going to depend on how you operate. Could be much higher, right?
Yes. So I think sort of mid-teens, around 15% is certainly reasonable. I think it's an expectation that we all drive for. How you get there, how you build the team, where you make investments and things like that, that's going to vary, of course, from business to business. But getting into, double digit, net income in the low teens and beyond. And I know there's very savvy, efficient, well-run businesses out there who are doing, well north of 15% net income.
Yeah, no, that's a great business model. Share with me one bit of wisdom that you would say is the cornerstone of your success.
One bit of wisdom, the course. So I think the biggest driver for us, and I don't know if this is considered wisdom, but it's our culture and who we are, is we're just maniacal about client service, and it's who we are. It's in our DNA. That was drilled in my DNA from my prior life, and I thought that's why we could make a difference in this space of the home services world. Always doing what's right, taking care of folks. I can't put my head on the pillow at night if I feel like we've let somebody down or we didn't meet expectations. And we're not perfect, but what we tell folks is, when we do fall short and maybe we didn't achieve a level, we're going to keep going till we fix it or make it right or reach somewhere where the client is happy. And I think there's times when we find ourselves in a little bit of pickle, and it can create a hassle. There's more expenses to do that, but at the end of the day, I think drawing it back to kind of the North Star, like, is this the right thing to do for the client, to deliver for the client? Because at the end, we're a local small business. I see all these people all over town. Our reputation's all that we have, and it can, we could spend 3 years building it up, and one instance can put quite a dent or tear it down very quickly. And so our goal is to never have that situation, because we're just going to focus on, doing the right thing and delivering folks an exceptional experience.
So what's your goal now? What's your future? How many territories?
It's an interesting question. I think in my territory here, I still think there's a lot of untapped opportunity. We've leaned a little bit more into the commercial space, into doing some more B2B work and building, partners in different verticals. And I think those two, between B2B and commercial space, are incredibly underserved in our market. And so I think we are just getting started there. Residentially, I think we're taking market share every single week, right? We didn't exist 3 years ago, and we have a lot of local competitors who have quite a head start on us. And I think that's we're chipping away at that. More territories, sure, that could be part of that. Could be if the right opportunity presents itself, that could certainly be in the cards down the line. But I think if knock on wood, if all goes well, this year, we're going to double from last year, and I think there's a lot of runway left here to capitalize on what we have. And we're really fortunate to be in Central New York, where there's a lot of economic development and housing, and there's a lot of good things going on at a very macro level, where I think we can catch quite a bit of that activity too.
Awesome. Brad Hawkins, Floor Coverings International, maniacal about customer service. Thank you for being here, my friend.
I appreciate it, Lance. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure.
If you're ready to talk about franchise opportunities, hit the link below to schedule a call. My services are free, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for listening.